We turn now to the Beatles' first movie, and that is A Hard Day's Night. This is a classic film. We think about that film at least years later now. A lot of people who are younger and who don't already know the stories about the Beatles expect that it was probably a more carefully crafted affair than it actually was. In fact, A Hard Day's Night was put together very, very quickly because there was a sense, and this went on for years into the Beatles' career, that they were simply the flavor of the week, and that the fickle pop audience would turn away from the Beatles just as quickly as they had turned toward them, and that they needed to make as much money and work this thing as hard as they could before that happened. And so one of the important elements behind the decision to make A Hard Day's Night was the Beatles were getting so many invitations to do performances that they couldn't take them all. And so if you've got a film that plays in theaters all across the country, really around the world all the time, you've got a chance to make money from the group, even when the group can't physically be in all those places. But they had to put it together quickly because they were afraid that the whole thing would cool down before the movie came out. They didn't want to spend too much money on it, so they filmed it in black and white and not in color. The movie itself was premiered in London on July the 6th, 1964, so that's several months after the Ed Sullivan Show. It was directed by Richard Lester, and as I said before, shot in black and white. Richard Lester was also a kind of a musician, kind of a jazz pianist, as Paul McCartney describes him, and had also done some kind of comedy films. So like George Martin, he had a kind of a connection that kind of clicked with the Beatles' sort of sense of comedy and fun and that kind of thing. All of the dialogue was written by, I believe the guy's name is Alan Owen. I believe he's Welsh. And he actually traveled with the Beatles for a little while to kind of get an idea of the pattern, their kind of personalities and the pattern between them and all that, and did a fantastic job of kind of characterizing each Beatle, giving them each a kind of a personality. Paul, the kind of charming one, John, the kind of ironic and somewhat acerbic one, George, the kind of quiet one, Ringo, the, well, whatever it is that Ringo is, one. And those images really kind of stuck from A Hard Day's Night. It was filmed in March and April of 1964, and as I said before, released hastily to capitalize on what was thought could be the band's fleeting success. So here they are trying to make a movie, trying to make records, trying to do concerts, trying to do all these kinds of things. If you look at one of those Beatle date books from any of these kinds of periods, you see that they are busy, but like I said before, make hay while the sun shines. The idea of doing a movie to promote a band was not something new. It wasn't like the Beatles came up with something that nobody had done before. We can look at, for example, the Elvis movies, starting with Love Me Tender from late 1956 and all the Elvis movies that followed. By the time we got to 63 or 64, who knows how many movies Elvis had out, but there were an awful lot of them. Alan Freed, the famous rock DJ, appeared in 5 total movies between 1956 and 1959, which really were sort of like sort of hastily constructed stories with an opportunity to provide kind of performances, mostly lip-synced for the performers, the pop and rock performers of the day. A big one that seems to influence a lot of people in the UK is a movie called The Girl Can't Help It, which had little Richard in it, Jane Mansfield. That came out in late 1956. So the idea of having pop music in a movie was not new with A Hard Day's Night. When we look at television in the United States, Ricky Nelson had gotten his start as a musician on his parents' television show that he had been a star on as a child, Ozzie and Harriet, and he had a whole series of hits at the end of the 50s and in the early 1960s. American Bandstand, led by Dick Clark, was big on TV during those years as well. And in the UK, a very important person by the name of Jack Good, who was a television producer in the UK, put together some television shows that his advocates would say were much more sophisticated than what was happening in America at the time. Shows like the 6-5 special from 1957-58, Oh Boy, from 1958 to 1959, Boy Meets Girls from 1959 to 1960, and importantly for our story in many ways, he comes to the United States, to the ABC television network, and between 1964 and 1966 produces a show called Shindig, which along with Where the Action Is and Hullabaloo, was one of the big teen music shows in the United States during that time. So again, the idea behind this movie was that the band can only do so many live shows, but a movie gets to play everywhere all of the time. The idea of the Beatles as these sort of zany, fun-loving, smart alecky in some kinds of ways, musicians sort of reacting to the world around them, became a very important kind of style point. I mean, half of what made the Beatles so appealing was their music. The other half of what made them so appealing were their personalities. In fact, when George Martin looks back at what he heard at that first audition, he thought the music was okay, but it was their personalities that he thought really came through, the charisma. And so A Hard Day's Night really brings that out, and many groups would try to imitate that. Most famously, into 1966, the Monkees, that television show, the Monkees, really became a kind of a weekly American TV version of what A Hard Day's Night had been in 1964. So an important record, an important movie for the Beatles for sure, and a kind of a landmark, I think, too, as we sort of chart if we were talking about the history of rock, we would want to chart the path toward music video. We could certainly point to something like A Hard Day's Night as being a very important step in that direction. I can tell you that a little personal anecdote having to do with my own experience. In 1964, I was 5 years old. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, took me to see A Hard Day's Night at the local theater, the Terrace Theater on Plymouth Road in suburban Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up. So 5-year-old, I go in, because I was a Beatles crazy. I go into the theater with her, and, you know, we get our popcorn or whatever, we sit down, we find a seat, and the lights go down, and the minute the lights go down in the theater, all of these teenage girls in the theater start to scream. And the movie comes on, and the Beatles come on the screen, and they spend most of the movie standing up screaming. Now, look, they're screaming at a movie. The Beatles can't even hear them, right? This is how sort of crazed this Beatlemania thing was. I remember saying to my grandmother, you know, could you tell him to sit down? I can't see. So anyway, I didn't see very much at that showing of the film, but we went back several weeks later. I got to see it again, or however later it was, but I got to see it again where I could actually see the entire movie. But just to give you an idea of the craziness, who screams at a movie? You know, and a whole group full of people. And that was happening at theaters all around the world, all across the country. That's what Beatlemania was. Well, we've talked quite a bit about the movie. Let's turn in the next video to A Hard Day's Night, the album.